Welcome in. Whether you're prepping for a massive presentation or maybe just trying to wrap your head around the current state of the world, or, you're simply one of those insanely curious people who loves peeling back the layers of how things actually work, well, we are thrilled you're joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a really fascinating journey for you today.
We really do. For you listening, we're going on a massive deep dive today.
Yeah.
It's a lot like buying a house. When you first walk through the front door of a new place, what do you usually notice? You're looking at the paint colors, maybe the crown molding.
Right, you're imagining where your couch is gonna go.
Exactly. You're observing the finishing touches, the surface level stuff.
The aesthetic layer that everyone just interacts with daily.
Yeah, but you don't immediately pull up the floorboards to look at the foundation. You just sort of assume it's solid.
Which is a big assumption.
Huge. Because if that foundation was poured unevenly, or, if the original architects intentionally designed the hallways so that only certain types of people could even fit through them, well, eventually you're going to see cracks in the drywall.
Or doors won't shut right.
Exactly.
Right.
The house might even start tearing itself apart. And today, we are pulling up the floorboards of the United States.
We are examining the architectural blueprints of the American social contract.
Right. Our mission today is an intricate exploration of the complex and, honestly, often incredibly fragile relationship between the citizen and the government. We're going to try to figure out how structural inequalities were literally baked into the foundation of the country.
And how marginalized groups have fought tooth and nail to expand their civil rights over centuries.
Yeah, and ultimately what actually happens when the social contract that supposedly ties us all together reaches its absolute breaking point.
To navigate a topic this vast, we've pulled together a phenomenal, deeply varied stack of sources for this deep dive.
It's a heavy stack today.
It really is. We're analyzing academic lectures on federalism and the mechanical design of the Constitution. We have Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s profound letter from a Birmingham jail.
Such a powerful document.
It is. We're also bringing in deep philosophical critiques regarding where human rights even come from, alongside some really visceral contemporary commentary from Trevor Noah and Kimberly Jones.
And we'll also examine the specific vulnerabilities of populations covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act, victims of elder abuse, and this gets pretty dark, even the secretive corners of the CIA torture program. Now, before we jump into the deep end here, I need to be incredibly clear with you about something. These sources we're unpacking today, they contain highly politically charged perspectives.
Yeah, so.
They span the entire spectrum. We're talking distinct left-wing and right-wing viewpoints. And we are not here to endorse any specific political side.
Right, we are not taking a stance or telling you what to believe.
Not at all. Our job today is to impartially report the arguments exactly as they are presented in the source material. We just want to help you understand these differing viewpoints, the history behind them, and how they kind of intersect.
It is entirely an exercise in analysis, synthesis, and understanding, not political advocacy.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start at the absolute beginning. The blueprint. The U.S. Constitution.
Which, it's crucial to remember was actually our second attempt at a blueprint.
Right. People forget that.
The first was the Articles of Confederation. And according to the academic lectures in our sources, they were an unmitigated disaster.
The national government had virtually no power under that system. I mean, it couldn't even levy taxes.
It essentially had to beg the individual states for money just to keep the lights on.
Yeah, the source highlights this wild statistic. During one 5-year period, Georgia and North Carolina didn't send a single dime to the national treasury.
Not a dime.
The central government was so incredibly broke, it was literally selling off Navy ships. They cut the standing army down to less than 1,000 men. And this is happening while Britain and Spain still have heavily armed troops parked right there in North America.
The structural flaw was that it was a pure confederacy. Sovereignty rested entirely with the subnational governments, the states.
And because there was no overarching authority to regulate them, the Union was just unraveling economically.
States were slapping aggressive tariffs on each other's goods, literally treating neighboring states like foreign adversaries. There was even a meeting called the Annapolis Convention in 1786 just to try to figure out navigation problems on shared rivers.
Which is what eventually led to the realization that they needed a massive overhaul, right?
Exactly. That became the Constitutional Convention of 1787. They realized they needed a completely new foundational document to save the Union from total chaos.
So 55 men traveled to Philadelphia. And the demographics of this specific group of architects are vital to understand. Because, whoever designs the house determines the shape of the rooms.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Our sources lay out the exact measurements of equality, or I guess the lack thereof, in that room. 55 men, 100% white.
And over 56% had a university education, which was astronomically rare back then. I mean, 10 of them went to Princeton alone.
Right. 100% of them owned homes. Over 56% owned large tracts of land. 31% owned slaves. And 0% of them were poor.
The material conditions of those 55 men directly translated into the fears they harbored and the system they built.
That makes sense.
When we think of the founding of the United States today, we often project our modern 21st century ideals of universal democracy backward onto them. But the founders were absolutely terrified of a pure democracy.
They didn't view democracy as a noble ideal at all. They viewed it as the mob.
James Madison, who's often called the father of the Constitution, explicitly argued that pure democracies have, quote, ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention.
Wow. Tell us how you really feel, James.
Right. They believed that if the propertyless masses had direct control over the government, they would simply vote to redistribute the wealth of the minority, meaning the wealth of the men in that room in Philadelphia.
And they had a very recent, homegrown, chaotic example to justify this intense fear, didn't they? Rhode Island.
Ah, yes. Rogue Island.
The historical anecdote in the lecture source about this is fascinating. So in Rhode Island, the debtors, the regular working-class people who owed significant money to wealthy creditors, basically managed to gain control of the state legislature.
The people in debt were suddenly making the rules.
Exactly. And they concocted this scheme to essentially erase their financial burdens by passing a law to print massive amounts of paper money.
Which was functionally worthless.
Totally worthless. But they passed a law requiring that it be accepted as payment to pay off debts that had originally been incurred in solid gold and silver.
They legally forced creditors to accept this worthless paper at face value. If a creditor refused, they could be tied up in public squares and fined.
That's insane. And the economic fallout was catastrophic. It caused an 800% inflation rate.
The local economy completely collapsed, shops boarded up their windows.
And the wealthy elite literally fled the state to avoid being ruined by the legislature's mandate.
So the men in Philadelphia, these wealthy, highly educated, property-owning men, they look at the disaster of Rhode Island and say, absolutely not. We cannot let the masses have direct control over the levers of power.
They deliberately avoided building a democracy. They built a republic.
Right. A republic is fundamentally designed to act as a mechanical filter. They recognized that the people needed to have some voice to legitimize the government, but they wanted that voice heavily filtered, slowed down, and insulated through representative institutions.
It's like they were building an incredibly exclusive club. And they wrote the bylaws specifically to keep themselves safely secured in the VIP section, insulated from the loud, unpredictable crowd outside.
That's a great way to put it.
But I'm struggling with this part, though. If their entire goal was protecting the elite from the masses, why did they open the document with "we the people"? Weren't they at least trying to build a system that represented everyone in spirit?
Well, the phrase "we the people" is powerful rhetoric, but their legal definition of the people was remarkably narrow.
I see.
The mechanical structure of the Constitution they designed reveals their true intent far better than the preamble does. Initially, citizens could only vote directly for one half of one branch of the entire federal government, the House of Representatives.
Because the House was tied directly to population, and they gave them very short 2-year terms, so they were constantly beholden to the voters' moods.
But look at the rest of the architecture, the Senate. Senators were not chosen by the voters. They were appointed by state legislatures.
Right, and given 6-year terms specifically to insulate them from sudden shifts in public opinion.
And the president. They explicitly rejected a proposal for a direct popular vote. Instead, they invented the Electoral College, a system where state legislatures would choose elite electors who would then exercise their own judgment to pick the president.
And even getting that filtered structure agreed upon required massive foundational compromises that baked structural inequality right into the cement.
They did. To get the large states and small states to stop arguing, they made the Connecticut Compromise, the House, based on population, the Senate equal with 2 votes for all states.
But then they had to appease the southern states, whose entire economy was completely reliant on enslaved labor.
This is where the protection of elite, specifically Southern interests, becomes deeply institutionalized. The 3/5 Compromise is a prime example.
It's dark.
The southern states wanted their enslaved populations counted to gain more representatives in the House, but they obviously had no intention of treating them as citizens. So, for the purposes of political representation and taxation, enslaved human beings were mathematically counted as 3/5 of a person.
5 enslaved individuals equaled 3 free people on a census ledger. This gave the white Southern elite vastly disproportionate political power in Congress and the Electoral College, all while simultaneously denying those enslaved people every conceivable human right.
Furthermore, to secure ratification, they included the Commerce Clause. It gave Congress the power to regulate interstate trade, but it explicitly stated that the international slave trade could not be interfered with or banned prior to the year 1808.
They formalized the legal legitimacy of a system built on profound racial and economic exploitation, strictly as a transactional compromise to get the document signed.
Exactly.
So the blueprint of the country was structurally designed to protect the elite, limit direct democracy, and preserve the horrific status quo of slavery. But how does a system like that adapt?
What do you mean?
Well, if the rules of the game are set by the states, how did the mechanics of the government actively suppress the rights of citizens for centuries after those initial compromises? That brings us to the actual machinery of the system, federalism.
Right. Federalism is the operating system they chose to run the republic. It's a deliberate sharing of power between a national central government and individual state governments.
As opposed to a unitary system, like they have in France or Japan, where the national government holds all the cards and can just override the provinces whenever it wants.
Or confederacy, which they had just tried and watched fail miserably.
Exactly. So in the U.S. federal system, both levels possess distinct sovereignty within their own spheres. The Constitution grants the central government specific, enumerated powers like the ability to coin a single currency, regulate international trade, or declare war.
But then you have the 10th Amendment, which establishes the reserved powers.
The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. That sounds great on paper. It sounds like local communities managing their own affairs.
And in many ways, it allowed for crucial local control and respected the vast cultural and economic diversity of the various states. But structurally, it created a massive, devastating loophole.
Because the original Constitution did not establish a universal right to vote, right?
Exactly. It defaulted that power to the states. It gave state governments the absolute authority to determine voter eligibility, which allowed them to legally disenfranchise their own citizens.
And the sources detail the absolute horror of how this played out, particularly after the Civil War.
Following the Civil War, the 15th Amendment was passed, explicitly prohibiting states from denying the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
But when the federal troops eventually withdrew from the South, ending Reconstruction, the white majority state governments immediately began weaponizing their localized power under federalism to bypass the 15th Amendment.
They couldn't pass a law saying black people can't vote because that would violate the Constitution. So they created a labyrinth of bureaucratic voter suppression that achieved the exact same result.
They implemented literacy tests. And the cruelty of these tests wasn't just the questions. It was the total unchecked discretion given to the white administrators.
The source explains how an administrator would pull up an incredibly obscure passage of the state constitution. If a white applicant couldn't read it, the administrator would just explain it to them and pass them anyway.
But a black applicant, even one with a college degree, would be asked impossible legal questions and automatically failed. The source even notes that they would publish the name of black applicants in the local newspaper,
which was a direct signal to white employers to fire them or to the Ku Klux Klan to target them.
It's just terrifying. They also instituted poll taxes, requiring a significant financial payment simply to cast a ballot, which severely hindered poor citizens, both black and white, from participating in the democratic process.
But the most insidious workaround was the grandfather clause.
Oh, this one is wild.
The states realized their literacy tests and poll taxes were accidentally catching poor, illiterate white voters, too. So they passed a law stating, if your father or grandfather was eligible to vote before the Civil War, you were entirely exempt from the literacy tests and the poll taxes.
Which is a breathtakingly blatant loophole. It explicitly excluded all former slaves and their descendants because none of their grandfathers could legally vote while cleanly protecting poor white voters.
The resulting disenfranchisement was staggering. The source points out that by the 1950s, in the entire state of Mississippi, fewer than 5% of eligible black citizens were successfully registered to vote.
Less than 5%.
Wow.
And the academic lecture makes a compelling case that this legacy of state-controlled manipulation of the electorate continues today, albeit utilizing different, modernized mechanisms.
Let's look at the modern equivalents detailed in the sources, starting with voter ID laws. Impartially speaking, the proponents of these laws argue they are simply common-sense measures necessary to prevent voter fraud and ensure that non-citizens aren't casting ballots.
However, the academic lecture source points out that extensive research indicates in-person voter fraud is statistically almost non-existent.
Right. The penalty for voter fraud is severe, often a felony conviction and potential deportation for non-citizens. And almost no one is willing to risk destroying their life to cast a single, statistically insignificant fraudulent vote.
But while the fraud is rare, the impact of the ID requirement is not. The data shows that roughly 10% of eligible American voters do not possess a government-issued photo ID.
And that 10% is not evenly distributed across the population. It disproportionately impacts the poor, the young, and minority citizens who might not drive or have the resources to navigate the bureaucracy of obtaining an ID.
And when you combine that state-level restriction with partisan gerrymandering, the manipulation becomes incredibly high-tech. State legislatures use advanced computer algorithms to pack and crack voting districts, drawing bizarre geographical lines to group their opponents into a few districts while spreading their own voters out to guarantee safe seats.
The source notes a specific example from 2012. Republican legislators in states like Pennsylvania and Michigan utilized mapping software to gerrymander districts so precisely that they maintained a comfortable, dominant majority of House seats, even though their candidates received significantly fewer overall votes statewide than their Democratic opponents.
So the machinery of federalism allows the party in power at the state level to essentially choose their voters, rather than the voters choosing them.
Precisely.
And this structural manipulation doesn't stop at the ballot box. This patchwork of state power affects the most basic, fundamental civil rights. The Vox source we reviewed highlights the ongoing LGBTQ civil rights battle. It introduces this vital legal concept called enumeration.
Enumeration is simply the explicit written listing of protected characteristics in a civil rights law. For instance, the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 federally enumerated race, color, religion, sex, and national origin.
It made it universally illegal across the entire country to discriminate based on those specific traits.
Exactly. But sexual orientation and gender identity are not federally enumerated in that same ironclad universal way. Because of federalism and the power reserved to the states, your civil rights literally become dependent on your geography.
In 29 states, because there is no federal mandate stopping them, it remains perfectly legal to fire someone, deny them housing, or refuse them public service simply because they identify as LGBTQ.
The Vox source goes further, highlighting states that have passed what are called no promo homo laws.
Which are just awful.
These are state-level educational mandates that forbid public school teachers from even discussing homosexuality in a positive or neutral light. The source heavily connects this lack of enumerated protection and the presence of these restrictive laws to severe psychological impacts, documenting significantly higher rates of bullying, depression, and suicide among LGBTQ youth living in those specific states compared to states with comprehensive protections.
We always hear this classic political talking point that local government is inherently better because it's closer to the people.
Yeah.
But looking at this history, from the grandfather clause to gerrymandering to LGBTQ discrimination, is federalism actually just a massive constitutional loophole designed to protect local prejudice?
What's fascinating here is the duality of federalism. It is undeniably a double-edged sword. Yes, the historical record shows it was the structural mechanism that allowed Jim Crow laws and violent segregation to flourish for nearly a century after the Civil War.
Right.
But conversely, it is also the exact same structural mechanism that allowed progressive states to legalize same-sex marriage, enact strict environmental protections, or raise the minimum wage decades before the federal government was willing to even consider those actions. It serves as a laboratory of democracy.
But the terrible cost of that laboratory is a deeply unequal citizenship. Your fundamental human rights expand and contract simply by driving your car across an invisible state line.
And that leads to a profound critical juncture. When the legal system, the voting box, and the structural design of the state itself are all rigged against a specific group of people, how do those marginalized citizens actually force change?
If the legal avenues for reform are cut off by the very architecture of the system, you hit a systemic dead end.
Which leaves you with a terrifying realization. If playing by the rules guarantees you lose because the people hurting you wrote the rules, you have to stop playing by them.
You have to step outside the legal framework entirely. And that leap from legal compliance to moral defiance is exactly what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was wrestling with in Section 3, breaking unjust laws, the moral duty.
To truly grasp the weight of Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, we have to establish the physical and historical context. It's April 1963. Dr. King is sitting in a narrow, solitary confinement jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama.
He was arrested for the crime of parading without a permit.
And he doesn't even have proper paper. He's writing this profound philosophical treatise in the margins of a smuggled newspaper.
And he's writing it in direct response to a public statement made by 8 prominent white clergymen from the South, right?
Yes. These were mainstream religious leaders who published an open letter criticizing his nonviolent demonstrations as unwise and untimely. They were essentially telling him, Dr. King, we agree with your ultimate goals, but stop causing trouble in the streets. Stop breaking the law. Go through the courts. Just wait.
Dr. King's response is a towering masterclass in moral philosophy and political strategy. He knows he has to directly tackle the paradox of his movement. How can he advocate for people to strictly obey the 1954 Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education outlawing school segregation, while simultaneously urging his followers to blatantly disobey local segregation ordinances in Alabama?
He threads that needle by arguing that there are 2 entirely different types of laws, just laws and unjust laws. And he provides an incredibly precise philosophical definition. A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God.
It is a law that uplifts human personality.
An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. It degrades and damages human personality.
He draws heavily on the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas and the existentialist philosophy of Martin Buber to articulate this. Segregation, King argues, substitutes an I-it relationship for an I-thou relationship.
Right, it artificially elevates one group while relegating human beings in another group to the status of things, stripping them of their inherent dignity.
But he doesn't just leave it in the realm of high theology. He gives a concrete political definition of an unjust law, and it links right back to the exact machinery of federalism and voter suppression we just discussed.
He says a law is unjust if a majority inflicts it on a minority, but doesn't make that same law binding on themselves. That's difference made legal.
And crucially, he argues a law is unjust if it is inflicted on a minority that, as a result of systemic voter suppression, had absolutely no part in enacting or devising that law.
He specifically points the finger at the state of Alabama. He asks the clergymen, how can any segregation law be considered democratically structured or legally valid when the state uses devious methods to prevent black citizens from even registering to vote?
He points out that in some counties in Alabama, despite having majority black populations, not a single black person is registered to vote.
That argument is structurally devastating. It completely invalidates the moral authority of the entire legal system of the South.
But the part of the letter that hits the hardest, the part that still resonates so loudly today, is his deep, agonizing disappointment, not with the Ku Klux Klan or the rabid segregationists, but with the white moderate.
King writes a searing indictment stating that he has almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block toward freedom is the white moderate. This is the person who claims to be an ally, but who prefers a negative peace, which King defines as merely the absence of visible tension over a positive peace, which is the presence of actual substantive justice.
The white moderate is the person constantly telling marginalized people to wait. King says he's heard the word wait for years, and it almost always means never.
And then he shifts from philosophy to the visceral reality of his life. He details exactly why they can't wait.
He talks about seeing vicious mobs lynch mothers and fathers at will, seeing police officers curse, kick, and kill black brothers and sisters with impunity.
And he talks about the quiet, soul-crushing psychological damage. He describes the agonizing task of trying to explain to his 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the new public amusement park, Funtown, because it just advertised it's closed to colored children.
He describes watching the ominous clouds of inferiority physically begin to form in her young mind. It's a heartbreaking and enraging section of the letter.
And it serves to perfectly explain why King argues that tension is not a byproduct of his movement. Tension is an absolute necessity.
He outlines the meticulous, disciplined 4 steps of any nonviolent campaign. First, the collection of the facts and determine if injustices truly exist. Second, negotiation with the power structure. Third, self-purification, preparing mentally to accept violence without retaliating. And finally, direct action.
And he emphasizes that they tried negotiation in Birmingham. He sat down with the civic leaders. The merchants promised to take down the humiliating racial signs in their stores, so King agreed to call off the protests.
But weeks passed, and the signs stayed up. They were the victims of a broken promise. So they moved to direct action. And King is entirely unapologetic about the core objective of that action. The goal is to manufacture a crisis.
He states that nonviolent direct action seeks to foster such a profound tension that a community that has constantly refused to negotiate is finally forced to confront the issue.
It dramatically, uncomfortably raises the stakes so the injustice can no longer be ignored or swept under the rug. King has this brilliant, vivid analogy in the text. He compares injustice to a boil on the human body.
He says a boil can never be cured as long as it's covered up and hidden. It has to be lanced, opened up with all its pus-flowing ugliness, to the natural medicines of air and light.
You have to expose the hidden injustice, with all the chaotic tension that exposure creates, to the light of human conscience. But I'm struggling with this part, though. If King is telling everyday people they have a moral duty to pick and choose which laws they feel are just and ignore the ones they don't like, aren't we just opening the door for anyone to justify breaking the law? Isn't that just a recipe for total societal anarchy?
That is exactly the fear the white clergyman voiced, and it's a profound question. But King makes a genius, critical distinction that separates civil disobedience from simple criminality. He is not advocating for evasion or defiance like a rabid segregationist ignoring a federal court order.
Right. He says one who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and crucially with a willingness to accept the penalty.
Accepting the penalty is the linchpin of his entire philosophy. By breaking an unjust law and then willingly submitting to the punishment going to jail, you arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice.
King argues this is actually expressing the highest possible respect for the concept of law. He places his movement in a long, noble, historical lineage.
He compares it to the early Christians facing hungry lions in the Roman Empire rather than submit to unjust laws, or the Boston Tea Party, which was a massive act of illegal civil disobedience against British taxation.
He writes, "We should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal." That line absolutely stops you in your tracks. Legal does not equal moral. The law is just a tool, and it can be wielded by monsters.
And King's entire argument, his whole justification for distinguishing right from wrong, rests on the theological premise that basic human rights are inherent. They are God-given natural laws that eternally supersede any human legislation.
Which is a beautiful, deeply powerful foundation for a civil rights movement. But it makes you wonder, what if we look at this through a purely historical and philosophical lens? If we remove the theological backing, the idea that rights are handed down by a creator, where do human rights actually come from?
Because our next source dives into the deep end of philosophy to suggest they aren't magical gifts from the universe at all.
Right. Section 4, the illusion of given rights. We are turning now to Jonas Yika's intricate philosophical breakdown, titled The Problem with Human Rights.
And this source fundamentally challenges the premise that rights are natural, eternal, or self-evident.
He starts by looking at the very document that birthed the United States, the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights.
Yika stops right there and says, hold on. Whenever a society calls a concept self-evident, it's almost always an illusion. It's usually just a blinding indicator of our own deep-seated cultural biases.
To deconstruct this, Yika makes a crucial philosophical distinction between objective rights and subjective rights. Understanding this difference is vital to understanding where our modern concept of freedom originates. So walk us through how those two concepts differ, because it really reframes history.
Objective rights dictate what is right, in general, within a society's overarching moral order. For example, if you look at ancient Greece, it was considered an objective right to bury the dead properly or to serve your city-state.
The focus wasn't on an individual owning a right. The focus was on maintaining the harmonious natural order of the world.
In fact, the source notes that the ancient Greeks literally couldn't even construct a sentence like, I have the right to free speech. The linguistic and philosophical concept of an individual possessing a right like property did not exist in their worldview.
So what we think of today, I have the right to property, I have the right to bear arms, Those are subjective rights. They are rights permanently attached to a specific, isolated individual subject. So if the ancient Greeks, who birthed Western democracy, didn't have this idea, where did it come from?
According to Yuka's historical synthesis, the concept of subjective rights emerged from a profound psychological and material shift brought about by two massive, intertwined historical forces: Christianity and capitalism.
Christianity introduces the revolutionary concept of the individual soul. Suddenly, in the grand cosmic scheme, your ultimate value isn't tied to your position in your local community or your city-state. It ties entirely to your solitary, direct relationship with God.
You are an abstract individual with absolute equal value in the eyes of the Creator. And eventually, over centuries, theologians began to argue that moral law wasn't just an inherent static order of the universe, but stemmed directly from the active will of God.
And since humans are supposedly made in God's image, that divine will gets translated into the individual will and agency of humans.
But philosophical ideas need material, economic conditions to actually take root and reshape society. And that's where capitalism, specifically a historical period known as the enclosure movement, provides the catalyst.
The breakdown of the enclosure movement in this source completely blew my mind. Think about how regular people lived before capitalism took hold. You had generations of peasants living on vast tracts of commonly owned land.
They worked the land together, they shared the harvest, they survived together. Their identity was entirely wrapped up in their communal existence.
Then the enclosure movement happens. Emerging capitalists literally build fences. They enclose the commons, claiming private ownership of the land to raise sheep for the profitable wool trade, and they forcibly, violently evict the peasant families who have lived there for centuries.
The material reality of human existence shifts overnight. Those peasants were violently stripped of their communal ties and their shared safety net.
They were forced to migrate into crowded, filthy cities to sell their physical labor for a daily wage just to avoid starvation. They went from being integral members of an interconnected community to atomized, isolated individuals, fiercely competing against their former neighbors for limited jobs.
And the emerging ideology of human rights perfectly matched this terrifying new reality. Freedom completely changed its definition. It became negative freedom, freedom from interference.
Because you are now isolated and competing with everyone else for scraps, you view other human beings not as a support system, but as active threats to your bodily autonomy and whatever tiny bit of private property you've managed to acquire.
You need a legally recognized shield to protect you from everyone else. And that shield is what we call subjective rights.
This profound isolation creates what the philosopher Karl Marx identified as the split society. Marx argued that under capitalism, human existence is fractured in two.
We are divided into civil society, which is the brutal, private, selfish sphere of the economic market where we pursue our own interests and compete fiercely, and the political state, which is the abstract, theoretical realm where we are all supposedly equal citizens endowed with human rights.
And Marx argues that the brilliant trick of human rights is that they obscure the massive, crushing inequality in civil society. The political state pats you on the head and says, look, you are free. You have the equal right to a fair trial, just like the richest man in town.
But down in the mud of civil society, the actual fairness of your trial is entirely 100% dependent on how much money you have to hire a high-powered defense team. The abstract, theoretical right serves to cover up the very real material inequality.
Which brings us to the core philosophical gut punch of this source, drawing on the provocative ideas of Friedrich Nietzsche. If rights aren't magically given by God, and they clearly don't fix the crushing material inequality of the real world, what are they?
Nietzsche argues that rights are not eternal truths. Rights are simply a recognized degree of power.
He wrote, "My rights are the part of my power which others have not merely conceded me, but which they wish me to preserve."
Think about it strictly functionally. Who actually enforces your rights? The state, the police, the courts, the military. The state holds a monopoly on violence.
According to this framework, the state grants rights to a marginalized group or the working class only out of prudence, fear, or a calculated desire to appease them and avoid a violent uprising that would threaten the state's existence. Here's where it gets really interesting, but it also sounds incredibly cynical. Are we saying the concept of human rights is basically a scam? Should we just throw out the Declaration of Independence and give up?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, no, the source is definitely not arguing that rights are useless or bad. The fundamental problem is relying on the benevolence of the state to grant them.
Oh, I see.
The profound realization here is that rights are the historical outcomes of struggle. They are peace treaties. They are compromises forced upon the state by a group of people who have organized and demonstrated their collective power.
Which maps perfectly onto exactly what MLK was doing in Birmingham. The federal government didn't pass the Civil Rights Act out of the goodness of its heart. The movement organized, they boycotted, they marched, they took beatings on national television.
They created so much nonviolent tension and so much economic disruption that the state was practically forced to concede those rights simply to restore order and get the economy moving again.
Precisely. But Nietzsche offers a chilling warning that goes with that realization. If the power dynamics change, if the marginalized group gets complacent or loses its organized power or the state becomes overwhelmingly strong, the state will simply take those rights away.
Because they are not permanent divine gifts, they are temporary agreements.
So rights are a compromise, a fragile peace treaty between the powerful and the powerless. And society itself is just a grand social contract where we all agree to abide by these compromises so we don't destroy each other. But what happens when the state continuously violently fails to uphold its end of the bargain? What happens when the peace treaty is shredded?
That brings us into Section 5, the fragility of the social contract. To examine the breaking point of this contract, we are looking at powerful, visceral commentary from comedian Trevor Noah and author Kimberly Jones.
Both of these pieces were recorded during the massive nationwide civil unrest following the horrific murder of George Floyd by police in 2020.
Trevor Noah starts by asking a remarkably simple but profound question. Why do we not loot Target every single day?
And his answer cuts right to the core of society.
Yeah.
He says it's because of the social contract. Even people who are utterly destitute, who are starving, who have absolutely nothing, largely choose not to smash the windows and take what they need because they have signed this unspoken, invisible contract.
They agree to play by the rules, to respect property, because they believe that if they participate, the society will eventually work for them too, or at least protect their basic right to life.
But Noah points out the unbearable hypocrisy. Black Americans watch time and time again as the very enforcers of that contract, the police, the agents of the state, blatantly break the rules.
When millions of people watch a police officer casually murder George Floyd on camera, kneeling on his neck for over 9 minutes while he is handcuffed and begging for his mother, and the initial reaction of the justice system is to do absolutely nothing, what part of the contract is that?
Noah argues that a contract is only valid if all parties adhere to it. There is no contract if the people in power, the ones with the monopoly on violence, don't uphold their end.
He points out that society's profound outrage over the looting of a Target store is completely misplaced and morally bankrupt when the agents of the state are looting Black bodies and Black lives every single day without consequence.
And this blistering anger, this deep historical feeling of the contract being utterly and violently nullified, is crystallized in an incredible, unforgettable analogy by Kimberly Jones. She compares the economic history of Black Americans to a rigged game of Monopoly.
And we need to look closely at the specific historical details she uses to build this analogy, because it proves that the breaking of the contract isn't just about police violence, it's deeply rooted in economic sabotage.
She says, imagine playing Monopoly with me. But for the first 400 rounds of the game, representing the centuries of chattel slavery, you aren't allowed to have any money, can't buy any properties on the board, you just have to play, do all the grueling work, and generate wealth entirely for me.
Then, after a bloody civil war, the rules supposedly change. But for the next 50 rounds, representing the Jim Crow era, every single time you manage to scrape together a little bit of money and build up some wealth on your own, I get to walk over and literally burn it to the ground.
She doesn't just speak in metaphors. She specifically names historical atrocities like Tulsa and Rosewood.
Tulsa, Oklahoma, specifically the Greenwood District, was widely known as Black Wall Street. In 1921, it was one of the most affluent, thriving Black communities in the entire country.
They were entirely self-sufficient. They owned their own grocery stores, banks, theaters, and homes.
And a white mob, actively deputized and armed by local city officials, descended on the neighborhood. They literally dropped improvised firebombs from private airplanes and burned the entire 35-square-block district to ashes.
Hundreds of Black citizens were massacred. Generations of built wealth were instantly decimated. And Rosewood, Florida, in 1923, was another entirely self-sufficient, property-owning Black town that was completely destroyed by a racist mob over a fabricated accusation while law enforcement stood by and watched.
So Kimberly Jones asks the ultimate question. If you are forced to play 400 rounds where everything you make is stolen by me, and then 50 rounds where everything you manage to build is bombed and burned to the ground, how can you possibly win the game?
You can't. The game is entirely fixed. The economic foundation was designed to ensure you never become an equal player.
So when critics watch the news and ask, why are they rioting? Why are they burning down their own neighborhoods and local businesses? Kimberly Jones's response is devastating. She looks at the camera and says, it's not ours. We don't own anything.
It connects perfectly, tragically, back to the philosophy of Nietzsche and Marx. If civil society completely locks you out of economic ownership through centuries of systemic wealth destruction, and the political state routinely refuses to protect your physical life from its own police force, you have absolutely zero vested interest in maintaining the contract.
Exactly.
I understand the deep historical anger, but honestly, when we see riots or looting, aren't people just destroying their local grocery stores and pharmacies, the places their own neighbors rely on? How does burning down a local business actually help fix the social contract?
To frame this strictly through the analytical lens of the sources we are discussing, the argument Kimberly Jones and Trevor Noah are making isn't necessarily that rioting is a calculated strategic tool for policy change.
Okay.
Rather, they are arguing that it is the inevitable, explosive result of a broken contract. Dr. King himself famously said that a riot is the language of the unheard. When a society disenfranchises a group so completely, structurally, and economically, the steady demand for peace and order from the elite rings completely hollow.
People aren't trying to fix the contract in that moment. They are viscerally demonstrating that, for them, the contract no longer exists.
Precisely.
And it's crucial to understand that it's not just racial minorities who find the social contract failing them. We have to broaden the lens to look at other marginalized, highly vulnerable populations who are routinely left behind by the very systems that were supposedly designed to protect them. Let's look at the source analyzing the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA.
The ADA is a landmark civil rights law enacted in 1990, prohibiting discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life. But looking closely at its application reveals how conditional our societal protections actually can be.
The source video on the ADA dives into the legal weeds of who is actually protected. It's not just anyone with a medical condition. To be protected by the social contract under the ADA, you have to prove you have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, or have a record of such an impairment.
And the core tension, the battleground of the ADA, revolves around the legal concept of reasonable accommodation. Employers are required by law to provide accommodations like modifying office equipment, providing sign language interpreters, or adjusting work schedules to allow a qualified disabled person to perform their job.
Unless, and this is the massive loophole, they have to provide it unless it causes undue hardship to the employer. Meaning, if the accommodation is deemed too difficult or too expensive based on the size and financial resources of the business, the employer legally doesn't have to do it.
This social contract protects your fundamental right to work and participate in society, but only up to the exact point where it inconveniences the capitalist machinery too much. Your rights are weighed on a scale against corporate profit.
And then we see an even darker, more intimate failure of the social contract when we look at the source from the Witness documentary regarding elder abuse. This video was incredibly difficult to watch.
Elder abuse is described by experts as one of the most widespread yet invisible crimes in America. The social contract is fundamentally supposed to protect the most vulnerable members of society, but here we see seniors kept as literal prisoners in their own homes.
The specific cases detailed in the documentary are horrifying and deeply tragic. They highlight a World War II veteran, a man who survived the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And his caregiver slowly, methodically isolated him from his friends, eroded his self-esteem, and systematically drained his life savings.
The caregiver was buying Rolex watches, a Vegas timeshare, and taking luxury trips to Chicago with his money, all while the veteran wept on camera, explaining how he thought he was losing his mind.
Or the story of the aunt whose own family put a heavy metal security grate over her bedroom door. They physically trapped her inside her small room while drug dealers and gang members operated a trap house out of her living room.
And another devastating case where an elderly man with early-onset Alzheimer's was manipulated into participating in an illegal operation. The abusers opened 28 different credit cards and 15 cell phones in his name, ultimately draining $750,000 of his hard-earned wealth.
These are elders who own their homes outright. They spent their entire lives contributing to society, paying taxes, raising families, and in some cases, fighting in massive global wars to defend the state. And yet, at their absolute most vulnerable stage of life, the protections of the state completely vanish.
They are exploited and abused, not just by random strangers, but often by hired caregivers and, most tragically, their own family members. It highlights a massive systemic failure of the state to monitor and protect citizens who physically and cognitively can no longer organize or advocate for themselves.
The contract shails them because they no longer have the power to force the state to look at them. But when the social contract breaks down domestically, whether through racial injustice, corporate loopholes, or neglecting the elderly, it reveals the raw underlying power of the state. It shows the cracks.
Right.
But what happens when the government doesn't just fail to uphold the contract, but explicitly, legally decides that the rules no longer apply at all? What happens when the state claims that an emergency of national security requires them to abandon the Constitution entirely?
That brings us to our final exploration: checks, balances, and the state's monopoly on power. To understand this, we have to return to the original architecture of the Constitution. The founders, despite their flaws, knew that the state they were creating was inherently dangerous. They knew that power corrupts.
So they built the system of separation of powers, dividing the government into the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, specifically to prevent tyranny. The branches are supposed to jealously guard their power and constantly check each other.
But the historical sources we're reviewing show us that when the country is gripped by sudden, overwhelming fear, those checks and balances often fail completely and spectacularly. Let's look at the horror of Japanese internment during World War II.
In the chaotic, terrifying aftermath of the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This order authorized the military to force over 100,000 people of Japanese descent, the vast majority of whom were natural-born U.S. citizens, from their homes and businesses on the West Coast, and incarcerate them in desolate detention camps.
They were given just days to pack what they could carry. They were forced to sell their homes, their farms, and their lifelong businesses to opportunistic vultures for absolute pennies on the dollar.
They lived in hastily constructed barracks behind barbed wire, under the watch of armed guards. And you have to ask, where were the checks and balances? Did Congress step in to stop the president from locking up American citizens without trial?
No. Not a single senator or House member introduced a bill to rescind the policy.
Did the Supreme Court strike it down as a blatant violation of the Constitution? No. They reviewed the policy 3 separate times, including the infamous Korematsu case, and they upheld the internment every single time.
It was a catastrophic, total collapse of the entire constitutional system of checks and balances. The executive branch seized absolute power, and the other 2 branches capitulated out of fear.
Decades later, the U.S. government issued a formal apology and reparations, explicitly admitting that the internment was not driven by actual military necessity, but by race prejudice, war hysteria, and a profound failure of political leadership.
But history doesn't just stay in the past. That exact same dynamic of fear overriding the law repeated itself after the September 11th attacks. We look at the deep dive New York Times investigation into the CIA torture program.
Following 9/11, the Bush administration made a calculated legal determination that the global war on terror required an entirely new set of rules. They argued that they had to operate completely outside the Geneva Conventions, outside of international law, and outside the normal constitutional frameworks.
To execute this, the CIA hired 2 psychologists, James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen.
These 2 men were former military contractors who had studied how to resist torture. The CIA paid them tens of millions of dollars to reverse engineer that knowledge and become the chief architects of the CIA's enhanced interrogation program.
They personally designed and implemented the psychological and physical techniques used on detainees in secret, off-the-books black site prisons around the world.
The video depositions featured in the source, taken from a massive lawsuit brought by the former detainees, are chilling to watch. You hear the detainees softly, painfully describe the sheer agony of the program.
Being shackled in agonizing stress positions for days on end, completely depriving them of sleep, being locked in coffin-sized confinement boxes.
And the technique they called walling, having a thick towel wrapped around their neck and being repeatedly violently slammed headfirst into a flexible wall by the interrogators. And then the video cuts to James Mitchell defending these actions under oath.
He talks about walling like he's describing a slightly uncomfortable carnival ride. He says, it stirs up your inner ears. It's discombobulating. It's not painful.
And when asked about waterboarding, a practice that simulates the terror of drowning, which the United States military had historically prosecuted as a war crime. Since the Spanish-American War, Mitchell casually dismisses the severity. He says, "It sucks. I don't know that it's painful, but it's distressing."
The semantic gymnastics he uses, trying to legally separate distressing from painful to justify the unjustifiable, are morally staggering.
And the craziest part is that the state apparatus pressured them to keep going, even when they thought it was too much.
Yeah.
Mitchell and Jessen claim in their depositions that after days of waterboarding a suspect, they wanted to stop.
But senior CAA officials at headquarters told them they had lost their spine, explicitly called them names, and told them that if there was another terror attack, the blood of dead American civilians would be entirely on their hands.
And top lawyers of the Justice Department wrote secret memos, signing off on all of it, legally claiming it wouldn't cause lasting psychological or physical harm.
A claim which is tragically and completely contradicted by the medical records of the detainees themselves, many of whom suffer from severe, debilitating PTSD, recurring nightmares, traumatic brain injuries, and deep psychological trauma decades later.
I have to ask the hard question here. In a time of actual war, or facing an unprecedented apocalyptic terror attack where thousands of civilians just died, shouldn't the government have the ultimate flexibility to do whatever it takes to protect the vast majority of its citizens? Isn't basic physical security the most fundamental baseline function of the social contract?
This raises an important question, perhaps the most vital question of this entire exploration. If we refer back to the academic lecture on the Constitution, the founders, having just fought a bloody war against a king, knew that tyranny almost never announces itself as evil.
Right. Give me your rights, and I will keep you safe.
Exactly. Tyranny almost always arises under the comforting guise of safety and security. If the government has the unilateral, unchecked power to define who deserves fundamental human rights and who doesn't, whether that's targeting innocent Japanese Americans in 1942 or holding Muslim detainees indefinitely without trial in 2002, then we return exactly to Nietzsche's cynical point.
Rights are no longer permanent guarantees.
They are merely a temporary power dynamic. If you concede absolute, unquestioned power to the state in the name of security, you have willingly surrendered the very rights the society was built to protect in the first place. You have given the state the legal key to void the contract whenever it feels threatened.
But the sources do offer a small glimmer of hope amidst all this darkness. They show that the checks and balances can eventually reassert themselves even if they fail initially.
Yes. The Constitution video points to the Watergate scandal as the ultimate textbook example of the system eventually working as designed. President Richard Nixon massively abused his executive power. He secretly taped private conversations. He attempted to use the CIA to forcefully block legitimate FBI investigations. And he orchestrated illegal burglaries against his political opponents. He acted like a king.
But the other branches woke up. Congress launched massive televised investigations. And the Supreme Court, which amazingly included 4 justices appointed by Nixon himself, voted unanimously to order the president to hand over the secret tapes.
He couldn't defy all the branches combined. The system forced him to resign.
And similarly, regarding the post-9/11 military tribunal set up in Guantanamo Bay, the Supreme Court eventually, after years of legal battles, ruled against the Bush administration. They stated unequivocally that the president alone does not get to decide the rules of law, even in a time of war.
The system can correct itself, but it is entirely reactive, and it requires extreme, relentless vigilance from the citizens.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and zoom out. We have covered a massive amount of historical and philosophical ground today. We started by looking at the original, flawed blueprints of the Constitution, a brilliant but compromised document designed by wealthy elites to filter out the voices of the masses and protect their own property, including the horrific protection of human property.
We saw how the structural machinery of federalism, while allowing for local diversity, was aggressively weaponized to allow states to legally disenfranchise minorities through poll taxes, rigged literacy tests, and modern algorithmic gerrymandering, creating a fractured patchwork of unequal civil rights.
We explored Dr. King's powerful, unyielding moral philosophy from a jail cell in Birmingham, understanding why breaking unjust laws, accepting the penalty, and creating crisis-level tension is sometimes the only possible way to force a deaf community to finally negotiate.
We dove into the deep end of historical philosophy, learning how the very concept of human rights might not be divine, eternal gifts, but rather temporary, hard-won compromises forced out of the state through centuries of material and power struggles.
We witnessed the agonizing, visceral reality of the social contract breaking down in real time. From the generational economic devastation described in Kimberly Jones's rigged monopoly analogy, to the daily injustices protested by Trevor Noah, to the quiet, completely invisible tragedies of elder abuse, where the vulnerable are locked away.
And finally, we saw the terrifying, unrestrained reach of state power when it decides to operate in the shadows. From the barbed wire of internment camps to the darkness of CIA black sites, reminding us why checks and balances, however slow and flawed, are absolutely essential for our survival.
It brings us right back to where we started, the foundation of the house. We often think of the Constitution, our civil rights, and our freedoms as a finished product. We think of them as an old historical document sitting safely under thick, bulletproof glass in a museum in Washington, D.C.
But if rights aren't magically granted by the universe, and if they only exist because ordinary people organize, suffer, and struggle to force the state to recognize them, then the social contract isn't a historical document at all.
It is a daily action. It is something we have to actively renegotiate, defend, and fight for every single day of our lives.
The maintenance is never done. The house is never truly finished.
So we leave you with this final thought to mull over as you go about your week. If the social contract is a daily action, what is your specific role in enforcing it today? And when you look around at the vulnerable people in your own community, the disabled, the elderly, the economically disenfranchised, the people who have been pushed to the margins, whose rights are you willing to demand when they no longer have the power to demand them for themselves? Are you just going to keep looking at the paint colors? Or are you ready to pull up the floorboards and check the foundation? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.